7th, wrote to Sir Hudson Lowe a statement of what Napoleon had informed me on the 4th instant would be the best mode of effecting an accommodation. Had a long conversation with Napoleon upon the anatomy of the human body. He desired to see some anatomical plates, which I explained to him. He informed me that he had tried to study anatomy at one time, but that he had been disgusted with the sight and smell of the subjects. I observed that plates only served to remind a person of what he had already learned from actual dissection, for which last they could never be entirely substituted. And this Napoleon perfectly agreed with me and gave me some account of the great encouragement which he had given to the schools of anatomy and surgery, and of the facilities which he had afforded to medical students to learn their professions at a trifling expense. Heard him express some sentiments afterwards relative to a few of the characters who had figured in the Revolution. Robespierre, said he, though a bloodthirsty monster, was not so bad as Coyot, Derbois, Biot, de Varenne, Hébert, Fouquier, Tinville, and many others. Latterly, Robespierre wished to be more moderate, and actually, sometime before his death, said that he was tired of executions and suggested moderation when Hébert accused the Queen de contrarier la nature, contrary to nature. Robespierre proposed that he should be denounced, and having made such an improbable accusation, purposely to excite a sympathy amongst the people in order that they might rise and rescue her. From the beginning of the Revolution, Louis had constantly the life of Charles I before his eyes. The example of Charles, who had come to extremities with the Parliament, had lost his head, prevented Louis on many occasions from making the defense which he ought to have done against the revolutionists. When brought to trial, he ought merely to have said that by the laws he could do no wrong, and that his person was sacred. The Queen ought to have done the same. It would have had no effect in saving their lives, but they would have died with more dignity. Robespierre was of opinion that the King ought to have been dispatched privately. What is the use, said Robespierre, of this mockery of forms when you go to the trial prepared to condemn him to death, whether he deserves it or not? The Queen, added Napoleon, went to the scaffold with some sensations of joy, and truly it must have been a relief to her to depart from a life in which she was treated with such execrable barbarity. Had I, continued he, been 4 or 5 years older, I have no doubt that I should have been guillotined along with a number of others. The 8th, Napoleon in a bath conversed at length about the situation of England, which he imputed entirely to the imbecility of Lord Castlereagh. If, said he, ministers had paid attention to the interests of the country, instead of intriguing, they would have rendered you the most happy and the most flourishing nation in the world at the conclusion of the war. They should have said to the Spanish and Portuguese government, we've saved your country. We alone have supported you and prevented you from falling a prey to France. We've made many campaigns and shed our best blood in your cause. We have expended many millions of money, and consequently the country is overburdened with debt on your account, which we must pay. You have the means of repaying us. Our situation requires that we should liquidate our debts. We demand, therefore, that we shall be the only nation allowed to trade with South America for 20 years, and that our ships shall have the same privilege as Spanish vessels. In this way, we will reimburse ourselves without distressing you. Who, continued he, could say no to this? France is now nothing. Besides, to tell the truth, it would only be a just demand, and none of the Allied powers could deny your rights exacted, for it was through you alone and the energy which you displayed that both Spain and Portugal did not fall. You might have asked, who say Portugal, who alone assisted you with men and money, besides having saved your existence as a nation. In this way, you would have had your manufacturers thriving, your sailors employed in your own ships instead of starving or being forced to seek a livelihood with foreign powers. Your canaille would have been contented and happy instead of being obliged to have recourse to subscriptions to keep them from starvation. As it is now, France will soon have the trade of the Brazils, as you have in your own colonies more cotton and sugar than you want. Consequently, will not take the productions of the Brazils in exchange for your merchandise. Now the French wills, Martinique cannot supply a quantity sufficient for the consumption of France. They will exchange their manufactured goods, silks, furniture, wines, etc., against the colonial produce, and soon have the whole trade of the Brazils. In like manner, they will have the preference in trading with the Spanish colonies, partly on account of the religion, and also because the Spaniards, like other nations, are jealous of a people all-powerful at sea, and will constantly assist to lessen that power, which is most effectually to be done by lessening your commerce. Another piece of folly in your ministers was the allowing any nation but yourself to trade with India, particularly the Dutch, who will be your greatest enemies. And probably before 20 years, when France has recovered herself, you will see the Dutch unite with her to humble you. If you had made those demands, they must have been granted, and the powers of Europe would not have been more jealous of you than they are now, and always will be, as long as you have absolute power over the seas and insist upon the right of search and other articles of your maritime code. You would then have the means of keeping up your maritime empire, which must decay if you have not more commerce than the rest of the world. But your ministers have had false ideas of things. They imagined that they could inundate the continent with your merchandise and find a ready sale. No. The world is now more illuminated. Even the Russians will say, why should we enrich this nation and enable her to keep up a monopoly and tyranny of the seas while our own manufacturers are numerous and skillful? You will continue to find that in a few years, very little English merchandise will be sold on the continent. I gave a new era to manufactories. The French already excel you in the manufactory of cloth, many other articles. The Hollanders in cambric and linen. I formed several thousand. I established the École Polytechnique, from which hundreds of able chemists went to the different manufactories. In each of them, I caused a person well skilled in chemistry to resign. In consequence, everything proceeded upon certain and established principles. And they had a reason to give for every part of their operations instead of the old, vague, and uncertain mode. Times are changed, continued Napoleon, and you must no longer look to the continent for the disposal of your manufactures. America, the Spanish, and Portuguese, Maine are the only vent for them. Recollect what I say to you. In a year or two, your people will complain and say, we've gained everything, but we're starving. We're worse than when we were during the war. Then perhaps your ministers will endeavor to effect what they ought to have done at first. You're not able to continue to face even Prussia in the field, and your preponderance on the continent was entirely owing to your naval sovereignty, which perhaps you will lose by this military disease of your ministers. England has played for nothing. Ha giocato per tutto o per niente. She has gained all effective possibilities, yet has nothing. And her people are starving and worse than they were during the midst of the war, while France, who has lost everything, is doing well, and the wants of her people are abundantly supplied. France has got fat, notwithstanding the liberal bleedings which she has had, while England is like a man who's had a false momentary strength given to him by intoxicating liquors, but who, after their effects, sinks into a state of debility. The 10th. Water is very scarce at Longwood. Sir Hudson Lowe gave directions that the horses of the establishment should be rowed to water to Hutsgate, instead of getting it from the tubs that were placed for the use of Napoleon's household. The water is then extremely muddy, green, and nauseous. In Deadwood, it is more easy to get a bottle of wine than one of water. Particularly of the 53rd, are employed daily in rolling butts of water to their camp. It reminded me of my former residence in Egypt, where we were obliged to buy bad water at an exorbitant rate. Charles, a mulatto servant, discharged from Longwood. Orders given by Sir Hudson Lowe that he should be sent to his house, underwent a long interrogation from His Excellency as to what he had seen and heard during the time he had been at Longwood. Application made to the governor by the orderly officer to allow a cart for the purpose of bringing water to the establishment, that in the tubs being so very scanty and bad. Napoleon, rather melancholy and annoyed that instead of the whole of the campaigns of Italy having been returned by Sir Hudson Lowe, only 3 or 4 chapters had been sent, desired me to tell Sir Hudson Lowe that he supposed he was getting them copied, and that according As they were finished, he would send them back. The 11th, went to Plantation House, and I acquainted Sir Hudson Lowe with the message I was charged to deliver him. His Excellency waxed very wroth and said that if General Bonaparte persisted in his belief that the papers had been kept for the purpose of copying, after the assurance to the contrary, which he had yesterday had from youngless causes, he, Sir Hudson, considered him unworthy of being treated like a man of honor and undeserving the consideration due from one gentleman to another. This he not only repeated twice, but obliged me to insert it in my pocket, and desired me not on any account to omit communicating those expressions to General Bonaparte. After having cooled a little, however, His Excellency rescinded his directions and gave me some explanations, which he desired me to make known to Napoleon, and ordered me to rub out of my pocketbook the obnoxious expressions. He then walked about in the library with me and said that in reference and reply to what I had written to him, General Bonaparte could not be permitted to run about the country. That if in the intentions of the ministers were only to prevent his escape from the island, a company's governor would have answered as well as any other person. But that there were other objects in view, and material ones, which he had been sent out to fulfill. That there were several strong reasons for not allowing him to communicate in the island, that any man might secure his person by planting sentries about him, but that much more was to be done. When I was about to leave the room, he called me back and said, "Tell General Bonaparte that it is very fortunate to him that he has so good a man for governor over him, that others, with the instructions I have, would have put him in chains for his conduct." He concluded by desiring to endeavor to get Sir Thomas Strange introduced to Napoleon.